Welcome to Bible study. You'll see I'm standing right here in front of our beautiful cross we have here at St. Michael's. And that's intentional because the emblem that's beneath there says, the cross of Christ is light to me. And we see this picture of Jesus behind here. I've always taken this to be a very much a missional kind of piece, that the cross of Christ being light to me it means that that's the only place where there's light. That I don't look for light somewhere else. And that shines its light in a way in my life that means, well, it means Christ gets to illumine what Christ wants to illuminate. And my job is not to tell Christ what to illuminate. My job is to see what he shines his light on. Today, as we continue in this Bible study in Matthew, we're going to see Jesus shine a light. And we've been doing this in light of our mission statement that's under consideration right now, that Christ calls us to grow and to serve our neighbor. And I think Matthew was talking to people and intending to have that same kind of a mission for them. Because Matthew's audience, we're pretty sure were actually Jewish Christians. And we think they were the Christians that had fled from the conquest of Palestine in the late 60s into the year 70, when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed at that point. It was a time of great pain and suffering and trauma for people. And we think Matthew writes this gospel both to encourage them and maybe to get them to refocus some things, because we know from the book of Acts and elsewhere that the Palestinian Jewish Christian community was struggling with a number of issues, including particularly their relationship with the Gentile community. We know that Paul's mission out into the Gentiles and the Greek-speaking world had gone remarkably well. There were congregations that had been planted out of that parish in Antioch, in Greece, and in places like Thessalonica and Berea and Corinth and Athens, and that there was a congregation in Rome, that there were a lot of non-Jewish Christians. But we think also that the people of the hometowns where Jesus had actually walked, that they were maybe struggling a little bit with that. And that here they were now, their lives had been disrupted by the Roman suppression of the Jewish revolt. And I think Matthew is seeing this as an opportunity to both open their eyes and maybe to get them to maybe have a little larger vision, all right, than what they were used to seeing. And so for the last 2 weeks, we've looked we've seen Jesus do a couple of things. One, he equipped his disciples. He said, go and feed all these hungry people. Even though they had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, he made it enough. And I think that gives us the idea that we don't necessarily check our resources, we check God's resources as we engage in ministry. But then last week we saw Peter sinking beneath the waves. He got out of the boat. Kudos to Peter. A lot of faith there. Got out of the boat, started walking toward Jesus, but then took his eyes off of Christ and was sinking beneath the waves. There's a lot of times in ministry when you will feel like you are sinking. But Jesus was right there with his hand, lifted Peter out, chastised him for his lack of faith, but then got in the boat with him. And the storm stopped, and they immediately got to where they were going. Today, I think these 2 prior messages are going to come together for the people of God in the 1st century and in the 21st century to say something really amazing. I particularly want to deal with the story that starts in verse 21 of chapter 15. But to get there, we're going to have to cover those other earlier verses very quickly. It starts with a conflict. The people who are the followers of the Pharisees confront the followers of Jesus and say, why don't you follow the traditions of the elders? Why aren't you doing what good Jewish men and women do? And Jesus flips it right back at them. This is one of the main themes of the Gospel of Matthew, is that Jesus is far more authentically an observer of the Torah than any of the Pharisees are. For these people who had been cast out of their homes by this rebellion, and we think also, as a course of all of this, we think the Jewish community was really rejecting the Jewish Christian community at this point. They're kind of saying, if we had all been good, faithful Jews, maybe we would have beaten the Romans. Maybe this Roman invasion wouldn't have been so successful, and it wouldn't have destroyed the temple. And they were kind of blaming their fellow Jews, but the Jewish Christians, for this cataclysmic problem that they had just endured. And so what Matthew wants his readers to understand is to say that, no, you are the true Israel, not the guys who are trying to kick you out. You are the ones who are following the real son of Abraham, and that's Jesus. But they get into this conversation about what is clean and unclean, what is kosher and not kosher, and how does that work. And Jesus says, listen and understand. Verse 10. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but rather it is what comes out of a person's mouth that defiles. The disciples approached him and said to him, you know that they kind of got the Pharisees took offense when they heard you say that. And he answered, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Notice the uprooting word. Just after this Roman invasion has uprooted everybody. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit. But Peter said, explain this to us. And he says, are you still without understanding? Don't you see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach, goes into the sewer, but what comes out of the mouth comes out of your heart? This is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intents and murder and adultery and fornication, theft, false witness. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a person. That's what they had been fighting about, the traditions of the elders and how one washed prior to eating. Now we get this really amazing story. The disciples are not understanding what Jesus is saying about clean and unclean and what goes into a person's mouth, what you eat versus the words that come out of your mouth. They don't see it. And so Jesus, being a good educator, being the master teacher that he is, takes them on a field trip. And it is quite a field trip. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. We know Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience because he rarely explains certain Old Testament things for us. The region of Tyre and Sidon would have been an enormous red flag, triggering kind of event for his first century Jewish audience. Because everybody knew about Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon are where the Canaanites lived. And if you know your Old Testament history, and these people did, it was because the Canaanites had corrupted the nation of Israel that the exile had happened. Because the people of God had not insulated themselves from the corrupting influence of the Canaanite really commodified religion. You're going to buy something from God sort of religion. That's why the exile happened. That's why the first temple had been destroyed. That's why they had been sent to Babylon. And the northern 10 tribes had been obliterated. They're gone. Only the southern one survived. A fragment, a remnant of the people survived. And so Tyre and Sidon has a particular resonance for the people of Matthew's audience. This is where the bad people are. Remember, Jezebel is a princess of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman. Now, we know there were a lot of words for the people who lived here. He could have called them a Syrophoenician woman. In fact, that's what Mark calls her when he tells this same story. But Matthew tells us a Canaanite woman. A Jezebel. From that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. Sometimes good teachers have to let something sink in, and they can almost talk too much. And so they have to be quiet and let students think about something. Jesus doesn't say anything here. I think this is the master teacher working his students. His disciples came up to him and urged him, saying, "Send her away. She keeps shouting after us. This woman is bothering us. Jesus, can you get rid of her? Either maybe heal her daughter and get rid of her, or just tell her to go away." And Jesus answered, and it's interesting, does he answer them or does he answer her? I think he's talking to them. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she then kind of does an end around. She goes past the disciples and kneels down right in front of him and says, "Lord, help me." And he answered her with this really, and to us it seems strange word that he says. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Does he call her a dog? It sounds kind of like he does, and in effect he does, but I think Jesus is maybe using this word somewhat ironically, because remember, the disciples are right there. And one of the words that Jewish community used for Gentiles, they are the dogs. Even if you still go to Israel today, you don't see a lot of pet dogs. For whatever reason, Jewish people, and a lot of people in the Middle East, they don't really think of dogs as pets. There are sometimes wild dogs, and there are sometimes feral dogs living in a community, but not a lot of people keep dogs as pets. They're just not considered a very nice animal. And so the disciples had probably been calling this woman a dog. And so when Jesus says, it's not right to throw the children's bread to the dogs, you can almost hear the disciples kind of jumping on board, going, "Yeah, exactly, Jesus. This is exactly what we mean. Get rid of this woman. She's bothering us. Her very presence is making us uncomfortable." But I think Jesus is saying that, so, you think I should get rid of her because she's a dog, do you? And Jesus says, "Listen up." The woman says, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And then Jesus answered her. Now this time Matthew is very specific. He's talking to her. "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Really important. In Matthew, Jesus says two people have great faith. One of them is a Roman centurion in chapter 8, and this woman in chapter 15. Only two people, neither one of them are Jewish. In fact, both of them are from a community that has a really problematic relationship with the Jewish community of Palestine. I think Jesus is asking his disciples to open their eyes, because remember what he said? It isn't what goes in, but it's what comes out. And by really managing this conversation with this woman, he has drawn out of her a profound confession of faith. A confession that none of his disciples were able to make. Matthew is asking his reader, including you and me, he's asking us to maybe be ready to have our world sort of blown apart. For the Jewish Christian community, they had been raised to understand that the Canaanites were all bad. And now Jesus is calling this Canaanite woman, a mother of a demoniac at that. This Canaanite woman has great faith. He says that about none of his Jewish disciples. For Matthew's audience, who were being kicked out of their Jewish community for the sake of their Christianity, I think he's telling them, look around you and find your allies somewhere else. And become part of another kind of community. A community that maybe even sticks its arm out and embraces people who are not like us. In fact, people that we have had problems with in the past. That can feel like you're going underwater. But don't worry, says Jesus, I'm right there. I will help. But I think what's really interesting is, notice what she says to Jesus. Yes, Lord, but even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Do you remember what Jesus did just a couple stories ago? When the disciples handed out bread and fish to the multitudes of people by the shore of Galilee. It says that after it, they gathered up 12 baskets full of broken pieces, crumbs. If you go on just a little bit further, you'll discover that there's another feeding of the multitudes, and the feeding of the 4,000, where they gather up 7 baskets of crumbs. And so here we have this sort of, well, I always like to say Jesus' crummy ministry, weaving its way right through this text. Even the dogs get the crumbs, says the woman. And Jesus' ministry has an abundance of leftover pieces of crumbs to share. He was calling, through Matthew, his first century Jewish Christians and his 21st century German Lutheran Christians. He was calling us, is calling us, to be people who find and see the love of Christ in others, who have our eyes and our hearts and our lives open to serving our neighbor, whoever they may be. Might make us uncomfortable, might sometimes make us feel like we're going under. We'll oftentimes look at the challenge and the problems that we're being asked to address and say, God, I don't have enough. I can't solve this problem. And Jesus says, that isn't the issue. Just go and feed them. Go and serve them. I will take what you have and I will make it enough. Pray about this text. Think about this text. If you want, come on Sunday, we'll talk about this text together. Have a blessed Labor Day weekend. We'll see you Sunday, I pray. God be with you.